All right, guys, welcome back. Today we're talking about David Hume, another important British empiricist. John Locke, also a British guy, also an empiricist. These guys are closely related in terms of their philosophical viewpoints anyway. David Hume writing the final word on human nature, doing his best to ground, all of human nature is a pretty impressive project, in empiricism, in the idea that we learn everything that we, or at least all knowledge is ultimately traceable to sense experience. Wrote a book called, I always get it wrong, it's the Treatise on Human Nature. The Essay Concerning Human Understanding is John Locke. This was the Treatise on Human Nature, where he got about 450 pages in or so, ran into some trouble, and said that he then threw his book, his draft away, that it was so full of sophistry and illusion that it had to be committed to the flames, which is just such a great phrase. Anyway, he did his best. He kind of went back, rewrote the old parts, did his best, still ran into a problem, and we're going to talk about all that. Ran into a problem that some say caused him to lapse into skepticism. In fact, if you look up David Hume online, you'll see that there are some people who consider him a skeptic and others who do not. Not entirely clear. Some folks say he had a nervous breakdown. Not sure that's exactly the phrase, but he definitely got severely depressed when he ran into the problem that we're going to describe here in a minute. Now here's how it works. For David Hume agrees with the empirical project that all knowledge is ultimately traceable to a sense experience. And he does his best to sort of carefully lay it out. And he gives us this distinction between an impression and an idea. So an impression, he says, is what you might call a first order experience. It's having a sensation, having a sense experience. That sense experience is an impression. It is the world impressing itself upon you. If you're a John Locke tabula rasa guy, it's impressing itself on your tabula rasa. Hume was perfectly happy with the tabula rasa idea, although he was not something that he, relied upon or anything like that. I think it's sort of an underlying assumption in the rest of his philosophy. So an impression is a sense experience. You can say he does a first order. That is, it happens first, and then you have, say, a memory about it or whatever. But the world impresses itself upon you. Just good empirical stuff. So an impression is a sense experience. An idea, all ideas, remember, he's a hardcore empiricist. And so as a hardcore empiricist, if you believe that all ideas are ultimately traceable to some sense experience, then an idea is going to be what David Hume tells us. An idea is a copy of an impression. What's the difference? Because it feels like we're really close to falling into Berkeley, right? Where, well, if an impression is an experience, but then an idea is just a copy, then maybe all ideas, maybe these impressions are just ideas as well, right? So he says that there is one defining difference between an impression and an idea. And it may not be really what you expect. Oh, sure, we might want to say an impression happens in the world, an idea happens in my mind, but that begs too many questions. Hume isn't going to go down that road. Hume, if he's going to, he's going to have to prove that. He can't say it and just start there. So what he tells us is, an idea is a copy of an impression, only fainter. It's less vivid. Whereas a sense experience is vivid, right? Lively. And it would not be wrong to say it happens to us, whereas ideas happen from us. So think about it. Like when you remember, I don't know, your 15th or your 10th birthday party or something like that. As you're remembering it, it's kind of like you're reliving it. But you're not totally reliving it. You're reliving it in a fainter way. Or if you think about some terrible experience you've had, as you think about it, you start to kind of relive it. You feel the feelings. You may have even heard that people say something like, oh, people don't remember what you tell them, they remember how you made them feel, right? So even in memory, obviously a memory is a great example of an idea. It's a mental thing. It makes perfect sense to talk about how memory is a copy of a sense experience you had. So that's kind of going to be what we're working with. Not all ideas are memories, of course. You can create ideas. So we're back to like sort of the mermaid thing. If it is true that all ideas are copy of impressions, how do I have the idea of a mermaid? Because I've never had the impression of a mermaid. I've never actually seen a mermaid. But I have seen women, and I have seen fish, and in my mind, in imagination, he has a special word for it, but it escapes me right now. In my imagination, I can sort of combine those different parts into something new, just like a unicorn. Doesn't mean I've seen one, but I have seen the components that I'm putting together in the idea. So, an idea is a copy of an impression, simply fainter. That's the only real difference. It's like you're reliving an experience when you remember it, only less lively, right? If you're with me so far, we are good to move forward. So, David Hume is very careful about this step, okay? That, remember, as an empiricist, he wants to make sure that he can trace all of these ideas to impressions. So, he's not going to budge from this doctrine. And it does lead us to some problems. So let's make sure we're on the same page first. A minute ago I was talking about mermaids and unicorns, and of course, while an idea is supposed to be a copy of impression, I've never had an impression of a unicorn or a mermaid, but those impressions, or rather those ideas, are made up of parts of things that I have experienced. And so he does agree with John Locke on this concept of simple and complex ideas, experiences, whatever. Remember the simple and complex, we were talking about the ice cube, how coldness is not the same as hardness and all that. We combine those in our mind into a single object. Hume is totally on board. He's like, yeah, John Locke, I'm with you. Although John Locke is after him. So an idea is a fainter copy of an impression. All of our ideas are ultimately traceable to some sense experience. Right? Follow me so far? So here's one of the problems. My dear David Hume. If all ideas are copies of impressions, where do I get the idea of causation? You know, like A causes B. Because I don't really have the impression. I don't really have the sense experience of causation. The best we can say is that I see A happen, and then I see B happen. I'll do some red. I'll do this thing green. See, when I hit the billiard balls, right? When I hit the cue ball and all the balls go flying everywhere, I say, well, this is because of forces, vectors, and so on and so forth, right? That hitting the ball in that certain way caused all this other stuff to happen. But if we're careful, we have to be, is for David Hume, all ideas must be a copy of an impression. What I see is A happen and then B happens. So I see sequence, but I don't see causation. Like this morning, right? First thing I did when I got up, brushed my teeth. Second thing I did, fed my dog. But I didn't feed my dog because I brushed my teeth. I merely fed the dog after I brushed my teeth. So when it comes to what are we actually sensing, we sense event A, we sense event B. Maybe we can say I sense event A and then I sense event B. But where do I get this notion that A caused B, that B happened because of A? That's not something I sense. That's a problem for David Hume. Because I do have the idea that we're talking about. But if all ideas are copies of impressions, I don't have the impression or the sense experience of causation. I only have the sense experience of sequence. A, then B. Not A, therefore B. See, there's a certain necessity involved in a causal relationship. When you say that one thing happens because of another, you're saying that another brought about the thing. Not just that they both happened, but that one relied on the other, or that the second one was brought about by the first one. And that's a problem, because that's the part we don't see. We see that B happens after A, but we don't see the necessity involved in a causal relationship. But we see causation all around us, or at least the causal structure of the universe is a fundamental assumption about the way we approach and understand the world. So this is where David Hume, some people say he lapsed into skepticism because, quite frankly, he was very sensitive to this problem. And he didn't try to pussyfoot around it. He didn't try to pretend it wasn't a problem, but he wasn't able to address it either. So some say he lapsed into skepticism. Some say he just got super depressed. He did go on for another 200 pages or so, trying different ways to try to solve this problem, unsuccessfully, right? In his own writing anyway. I don't want to say in his lifetime, I don't know how he died. But in his lifetime, this was a problem he was unable to solve. Kind of a problem. So causation's one. Also, we have this word up here, endurance. For us, endurance just means, watch this, right? This is a green marker, right? Is it the same green marker? Now, I know it's philosophy class, so you're like, oh, probably not. It's probably hiding stuff behind his back to trick us. And, you're right to be suspicious like that. I do like to do things like that. But I'm not. Where do we get the idea that this marker is the same as this marker? If we were to rely on experience, and we have to, right? Because it's empirical stuff. And because every idea is a copy of an impression. Well, what we should say is, I see a marker. Now I do not see a marker. Now I do see a marker. Where do we get the idea that it's the same marker? When we have a gap in our experience of it. Can't have an impression of it when you're not having an impression of it. Can't have an impression of it when you don't see it, right? So like, when you went away for spring break, you didn't see me. Do you think I still existed? I know you're gonna be like, oh, maybe not, but in reality, you do think so. Most people do anyway. We're gonna deal with them if we can't deal with you. Most people think I continue to exist. How is that possible? You have the idea of me continuing to exist when you don't experience me. How is that supposed to be a copy of an experience? The whole point is that you didn't experience it. You're filling in the gaps mentally, and that's fine, right? Barclay's going to say you're going to make it up. You're filling in the gaps mentally, and that's cool. They're ideas. But for Hume, every idea has to be a copy of an impression, right? This is a problem for him. Because look at what we lose. If he's right, and every idea must be a copy of an impression, but we don't have an impression of the necessity involved in causal relationships, well, if he was right, we couldn't even have the idea of causation. But we certainly can't count on it. Or endurance, right? The idea that things continue to exist even when we're not experiencing them. We can't have the experience of things that we're not experiencing, right? So how can we do have the idea that things continue to exist when we don't experience them? That's a problem. Because if we have the idea, that must be copied from something. Problem, right? Well, Hume has an answer. He does. So don't feel too bad. We'll go back to causation for a minute. Why do we say that A causes B? All we really have is A then B, right? All we really have is sequence. Hume is cool with that. He's like, you're right. All we actually experience is A then B. But over time, every time we experience A, very shortly thereafter it's followed by B, right? And so what we have is this continuity, you might say. This, well, he has a phrase for it. He calls it the constant conjunction of A and B. Every time A happens, B happens right afterward. Every time B happens, right before A happened. And so causation, the idea of causation, really isn't in the world. Okay? What we experience is this A then B. But we experience it so much. Every time A happens, B happens. We experience the sequence so much that we just develop a habit of expecting B to happen when A happens. And we call that causation. We say A causes B. So really, causation isn't in the world. Causation is really a shorthand way of talking about our habits. So that's another big word for David Hume. It's the same reason you think I'm the same Brandon that you saw before spring break, right? That you have a memory, you had some sense experience, you formed some fainter impressions, but now as you're having the experience, you're comparing them to your faint impressions and your previous sensations, your memories, and you're saying, yep, looks the same, must be the same guy. So it's a habit. It's not something you get from the world in itself. Rather, it is the world operates on our mind. A happens, then B happens, and it happens so much that once A happens, we just have an expectation that B will happen, and that is causation. Or, not conversely, but same idea. You see me, you compare it in your mind to these different memories you have, like, yep, looks the same guy, right? So the idea of endurance, something continuing to exist despite us not experiencing it, causation, the idea that there's a necessity involved in a relationship between two events, those are matters of our mental habits that we form as a result of our first order impressions. Not that exciting. Hume was not excited about it. Hume thought, well, I guess this is the best I can do. But it doesn't prove causation is true. It's certainly not true in the world. Causation is a reasonable enough way to view the world, but in the end, it's a matter of our habits. Same with endurance, or something continuing to exist despite us not experiencing it. This is why some people say he lapsed into skepticism. Because at this point, what he's done is take two of the most fundamental concepts of understanding the world, that things continue to exist even when we don't experience them, and the world is causally interconnected. And he's reduced them to, he feels like he's saved them, right, from the skepticism that we may have fallen into. So he feels like he's saved them, but in the end, they're mental habits. They depend on something happening up here. And for that reason, it does threaten to undermine this whole empirical work, right? Because the empiricists say that the world exists and the world acts on our senses, but all of our evidence, kind of like Barclay pointed out, all of our evidence for that is sort of a mental thing. And so when we come down to the most important basic relationships in the world, Hume says they're really kind of based on sort of a habit that we form from the experiences we do have. And that's David Hume in a nutshell for you. Of course, it was Hilary Putnam, who teaches up in Canada, I think he's still alive, who said that any philosophy that can be put in a nutshell belongs in one. Well, I'm sorry. I invite you to go read the 550 pages of David Hume and see if you can come up with a more thorough, and I really do invite you to read it. What we'll find next time when we talk about Immanuel Kant is that it was actually this problem that awoke Kant from his philosophical slumbers, in his own words. He said that he had read this treatise on human nature, and it was so full of crap that he had to kind of get off of his philosophical butt and start doing philosophy again. Because Kant is one of the handful of philosophers who was a famous philosopher in their own time. He had said everything, he kind of got bored with it, right? He had sort of written everything there was to write. I feel like he had sort of said the last word, but it wasn't until he read David Hume that he thought, this is so full of crap, I gotta get out there and fix all these problems. And in David Hume's defense, he did understand that there were problems. It caused some discomfort for him. So in our next video lecture here, I'm going to tell you about Immanuel Kant and how he details this problem and thinks he has solved it. And we'll see if you like it any better than you like David Hume. But for now, what you need to know, David Hume, empiricist, yes. We learn about the world through our experiences. You must know the difference between an impression and an idea. And just like with John Locke, you should know the difference between a simple and complex impression or idea, for that matter. You should know that causation and endurance are problematic for him, particularly because we do have the idea We do not have an impression to compare it to. If all ideas are copies of impressions, where did we get this idea of causation? Because we sure as hell don't have the impression of it. And Hume's answer, as you'll recall, is this habit. That by seeing them over and over again, right? Marker? No marker. Marker? Yeah, it's the same marker. Because it looks the same, because throughout the rest of my life, most things like that have worked, right? So I've developed this habit of comparing it to the other marker and saying, yep, that's the same thing. So all of this stuff, causation, endurance, whatever it is, these are all a matter, these are mental acts. These are a matter of habit that we form. And the problem there is, and you know, Hume just has to accept it. The problem is that it puts things like causation and endurance out of the world and into our mind. It's not a property of the universe, it's a property of how I put ideas together. But that's not what we want, right? Out of epistemology or metaphysics. We want some truth. So, again, for Hume, empiricist, all ideas are related to sense experience. In fact, all ideas are copies of a sense experience, only fainter. And so that's the impression idea. Causation and endurance, we have those ideas by a way of forming a habit regarding how we experience the world, how we relate to our different experiences in the world. If you've got that straight, then you're in a good position to move on and start talking about Kant. So there's David Hume for you. I hope that was good, as good for you as it was for me.